Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at our fragile ecosystem and global climate change and a variety of other issues that impact the planet. My guest today has written extensively on these issues. Ms. Kris O'Daniel, a native of Denmark, has a Master of Dairy Science and Engineering background. Her first employment was as an associate expert at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, commonly called FAO, stationed in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Kris periodically writes columns in the Lexington Herald Leader and on topics such as climate change and the fragile ecosystem. Kris O'Daniel, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks a lot. Interesting subject.
Yes, and so important. You're right. Very true. Well, I appreciate you being with me today, Kris. Let's jump right into it. You've got, I think you have 10 slides pulled up, and you're going to comment on each of them. And we'll just start. Well, let's just start with slide number 1.
All right. Well, here we are talking about how we need to remind ourselves that we live on a planet. And if humans want to have a future here, we need to refocus and recognize that our planet is actually an ecosystem. And we humans must immediately start to rebalance all these living ecosystems and change our waste products. For one, humans must wean ourselves from the fossil fuels.
And that includes, as you say, we've got to do it, and we have to do it together. It can't be done by 1 or 2 countries or 1 or 2 regions, but it has to be all of us together. Let's take a look at slide number 2.
Yeah, here we talk about the free service that the ecosystem is providing. And just briefly, I'll just state that we talk about reabsorption of emissions, greenhouse gases, and sequestering of carbon dioxide, the breakdown of biomass production and nutrient cycling and water filtration, all free services, part of how the ecosystems are working and have worked together for thousands of years. But all these services we humans are impeding by intercepting in various ways.
And that's very important too, that we realize that there's an interconnectedness in our ecosystem. And so often we don't realize that so many animals, or some animals that may be perceived as not very productive, really are, and they're part of that ecosystem. And it's a very fragile balance.
One certain thing is that the humans have decimated the size of the ecosystem to some 25% of its original size by land clearing as one. We all know about the Amazon, but it's way other places than just in Brazil. We all have responsibility for that, and we are simply amputating the ecosystem and its ability to function. Simultaneously, we are overloading it with waste, and particularly again our greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide are all waste products in our quest for energy, and again because of our addiction to fossil fuels.
I'm glad you mentioned the Amazon basin, because that is often referenced as the lungs of the earth. And it's now we see, and it's been going on for decades, that there's been cutting, a slash and burn approach to eliminate the trees, to raise cattle, to grow crops, which is totally counterproductive. It's very detrimental to not only to Brazil, but also to the entire world. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, as we'll see here, the global temperature is rising dramatically, and if we look at the since industrial or pre-industrial level, we will see how we have vastly increased by 1 degree centigrade in just these small 100 years. Doesn't sound of a whole lot, but if we listen to the scientists of the IPCC as an example, they are predicting we will reach about 1.5 degree centigrades already by 2030. And what is happening is we are seeing a acceleration. We thought it was a little slower, but we are seeing the result of that. We actually are accelerating, and that's because we have started to melt all these huge and vast masses of ice, and with that we release CO2 into the ocean as well, and that further increase the acidity. And we are, as we know, we are pulling out the carbon that was stored underground for millions of years. We are now pulling it out into the atmosphere just to make energy. And that's where our side products, greenhouse gases of various types, are produced. And we are creating preventing the infrared radiation from the sun to escape back to space, to the universe, so temperature goes up. So this is a very, very accelerating and evil circle, and we need to take actions.
And the scientists just reported that 2020 and the year 2016 have been the two hottest years in history as far as recorded records go. And of course, we're moving up. That we're not reducing our temperature. And we see that the side effect is that the glaciers are melting more rapidly, the seas are rising, the reefs are under siege, and it's just a terrible situation.
All living creatures and species, they all have an optimal temperature, and it's pretty simple in a way. We just look at us humans. We get sick at 2 degrees centigrades increase, and we die at 4 degrees centigrades, or depending on our condition. Species have always been adapting, but they just can't do the adaptation because this is such a fast change we are seeing. So we see how, say, fish are swimming towards cooler waters because that's their optimal range, and then there's not enough for them to eat, or is the type of food they can't eat. Temperature changes in the oceans, as I said earlier, are creating more acidity and breaking up coral reefs, and that affects again what is living in the ocean, and that's the evil circle.
It certainly is. And this is something that we have got to break this cycle. We really do. There have been a lot of positive activities that have been underway, but still, we're still moving at too fast of a clip towards some kind of Armageddon in climate change. Well, let's take a look at one more slide before we go to our mid-show ID.
All right. Yeah, here we are talking about the disasters. Here it's more like in United States. We have seen clearly severe storms, and with them comes flooding as one extreme. On the other extreme, we see wildfires. Both are very costly to human life and the environment, and of course they're very financially very much a burden. We can see how temperatures are increasing all over the world faster inside land than at the coast. And so people start to move, of course, away from the hotter areas, and then they will just meet perhaps a hurricane out on the coastal line. But the disasters comes in all forms, and are totally contrasting. If we could just have an average of it, we could see something positive, but that's not the way it is. We get the extremes to individual areas.
And today we see as the temperatures increase, the weather patterns change, areas become uninhabitable. We see climate change migrants who are moving from Central America, from other places on the planet into other countries, which can be very destabilizing. Yeah. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, you like our shows, you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at probably the most international issue you could think about, and that is the climate, our fragile ecosystem, and what is being done to try to help preserve it, because in the climate change battle, we're losing ground. But my guest today is an expert on this topic. Ms. Kris O'Daniel is a native of Denmark and has a Master of Dairy Science and Engineering background. Ms. O'Daniel periodically writes columns in the Lexington Herald Leader in Lexington, Kentucky, on issues that confront the climate change challenge and our fragile ecosystem. Kris, we're going through your slides, and I apologize, we're going fairly quickly, but we're going to have time at the end to talk about solutions and focus more specifically, I think. But let's move on to your next slide.
Well, it's good we keep it light. That's enjoying.
It's moving.
Yeah, so this is about showing how emissions per capita are different around the world, and China's population is about 4.5 times higher than the US, but the emissions per capita is about half of United States. China are producing, as we know, goods for the entire world. So in a way, from that point of view, they are not doing bad. And as we have seen earlier, they started just say 20 years ago with their industrial development. The US has been one of the slowest among the wealthier countries to decide that it's time to transition away from fossil fuels. China has had larger investments actually in renewables than the US over the past 5, 7, 8 years. The good news is that the investors in the United States is starting to see that it's a good investment opportunity to go for renewables. And so even we have had a lack of energy goals and regulations that has set United States back for sure. We have damaged our environment, but we are starting to see a change forward, it looks like.
The Scandinavian countries, who are really doing a very good job, much better than the rest of the world, I guess.
Yeah, they are interesting. They are small countries. I like to say, since I'm from Denmark, that in my opinion, one of their characteristics are that the wealth they have, which they are very wealthy, actually, it's because they have been very competitive. They actually have been really good at adapting, all in different ways. And I don't talk here in energy terms only, but adapting their finances, their economic success. And also their governments are different. There are many parties they can vote for. So whatever the vote gets to be, they are big democracies, so they trust their leaders is important to mention. So therefore, they have been very united in deciding to set high emission goals early on, and allocate the necessary funds. And so they all have long-term investment plans. They all are very far into fossil-free renewable initiatives. They all varying, and I don't know if you want me to fastly mention, but Iceland has volcanic activity, so they are using hot water, get hot water free underground. They're using that to preheat with, and Norway have a lot of dams, so their hydro energy is huge. Denmark is big on wind and is actually the biggest exporter of windmills in the world. Even it's just 5.8 million people. Sweden have a variety of stuff. Biomass, for one, they have a lot of old wood or deteriorating wood they're using for biomass, but they have also hydro energy and some wind. Germany is interesting. They have both nuclear and coal, but they actually have a lot of solar also, and wind. All these countries are working together. which is important. That's necessary when you have renewables.
That's very, very important. And that's the reason that every country in the United States is now going back into the United Nations Paris Climate Accord, which was adopted in 2015. Well, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah. So here we see that it's really just to point out the importance of what the wealthy countries have done to the not so wealthy countries, and also to point out that in the beginning, even in the wealthier countries, the growth we were making, which were all based on or depending on our ability to produce energy for our industrial development, but it was a slower development. So up to around 1980, we saw that growth would lift people out of poverty, as is stated here. And now, since then, growth that's created is causing more wealth inequality, and the poor countries are very unfortunate in this situation. They have to deal with, as we have seen here, that the 10% of the population who have created 50% of the emissions or the waste products are damaging the poor country. And the poor countries, they cause only some 10% of this waste, but they have the economic burden, and their environments are being so that is decimating their possibility of living their everyday lives. Even they have a more sustainable living style.
Well, that goes back to show how for decades, well, for centuries, really, the economically developed countries have produced not only wealth and growth, economically speaking, for the world in many cases, but also have created the problems. And of course, the economically developing countries did not create the climate change problem. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, here I just wanted to show the different sections or categories, and I would like to just to say that globally we can just talk about the three big categories are electricity, agriculture, including forest, and industry, which each about 25% or so. Transportation globally is smaller than for the US, which this slide is showing, and buildings, other energy services are less. The main thing is to mention that everyone, there's no production anywhere without a waste, and that's what we have to change.
We certainly do. We have no choice. Well, let's move to the last slide, and you have several important issues on there, and pick one or two that we can focus on to get a better feel for what can be done to confront these problems.
Yeah, I think with the top-down leadership I mentioned, it's just that we have seen in the United States as a typical example, without any top-down leadership, it has slowed our adjustment, our transitions. So it's very important to have a top-down leadership that is essential to speed up the necessary ground rules, we can call it. And that means like mandating utilities to procure electricity from renewables and introduce legislation to reduce the very severe and harmful emissions from our production use of coal and gas, which we still will depend some on. We have to do it cleaner, do a better job. Also, I just want to say that our investors are encouraged, and because they have seen now that it's a long-term, better financial option that creates stability, and investors want that. In the United States, we see investors are looking for social, environmental goals among companies before they invest, and they are aware of the emergency we have regarding the climate change. It's just another thing to mention is that solar and all the renewables, but in particular wind and solar generation and storage are now cheaper alternatives for the generation of electricity than coal and natural gas. So that's of course incredibly important. It's just that it takes, again, top-down leadership to force this change faster. We have to be faster now. With all this transition, of course, we will have to adjust our grid, and there are a lot of other changes that we have to do, and that means we have to work together. And now all that has had to do with how we can eliminate the emissions, the harm we have done, but we also have to help our ecosystems back to what it once were able to provide, and that means we need to increase carbon sequestration, and we have to stop cutting forests. We have to expand forests, and that's a big thing around. Wealthier countries have started to realize how by changing farming methods, also we can actually sequester more CO2 and make farming a more better place with less carbon footprint. I would like to say here as a conclusion of that it's all about understanding that humans must start to act as a partner to the planet. The planet is forgiving. That's the secret of the ecosystems. But the ecosystems will adjust, but humans right now, we have brought it so far that now it's time for the humans to adjust because we have gone too far.
That summarized it very nicely. And I'm so glad you pointed out all those issues. They're extremely important, and especially leadership. And we have had for the last 4 years almost no leadership as far as dealing with the climate change problem. In fact, the administration's made the problem worse by ignoring scientific studies, firing scientists, gutting agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. So that has to change and is going to change apparently. The other thing too, I'm glad you mentioned about businesses, because most, it seems like anyway, they may be paying lip service in some cases, but most businesses have come to the conclusion that climate change can wreck the economy, it can wreck the world, and it also, if they're involved, it can help improve their bottom lines and to actually make more money in helping to preserve the planet. But Kris O'Daniel, it's an important issue, it's an important topic. We could have spent the entire program on just one slide, but I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. It was a lot of joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.